April 5, 2006. United States Penitentiary, Pollock, Louisiana. The most secure federal prison in America. Richard Lee McNair, convicted murderer, armed robber, master escape artist, was about to do the impossible for the third time in his criminal career. In broad daylight, surrounded by razor wire, guard towers, and motion sensors, McNair would simply vanish from a maximum security facility designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in the country. No tunnels, no violence, no inside help, just the twisted genius of a man who had turned prison escape into an art form. Within hours, one of the most intensive manhunts in federal law enforcement history would begin. But Richard McNair had already become a ghost, walking freely among us while hundreds of agents searched for a phantom who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to disappear. This is the story of the most prolific escape artist in American criminal history. A man whose genius was matched only by his evil, whose freedom came at the cost of innocent lives, and whose cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement exposed devastating failures in America's prison system. For 15 months, Richard McNair would remain free while the FBI, U.S. Marshals, and local police across the country searched for a killer who was always one step ahead, always planning his next move, always proving that even America's most secure institutions were no match for a brilliant criminal mind. Minot, North Dakota, 1958. Richard Lee McNair was born into a working-class family that seemed ordinary in every way except for the darkness that lived behind their youngest son's eyes. From childhood, McNair displayed an intelligence that bordered on genius, but it was an intelligence twisted toward destruction rather than creation. While other children played with toys, McNair was dismantling locks, studying security systems, and learning how to manipulate the weaknesses in every barrier designed to contain him. His teachers recognized his exceptional abilities but were disturbed by his complete lack of empathy. McNair could solve complex problems with ease, but he seemed incapable of understanding why other people's pain should matter to him. Child psychologists would later identify him as a textbook psychopath, brilliant, charming, and utterly without conscience. By his teens, McNair had already begun his criminal career with a series of burglaries that showcased his evolving skills as an escape artist. He would break into homes and businesses not just for money, but to test his ability to defeat security systems and evade capture. The local police quickly learned that arresting Richard McNair was only half the battle. Keeping him in custody was nearly impossible. At 17, McNair escaped from the Minot City Jail by picking the lock on his cell door, disabling the alarm system, and walking out the front entrance while guards were distracted. It was a preview of the nightmare he would inflict on law enforcement for the next 4 decades. But McNair's crimes were escalating beyond simple theft. The same calculating intelligence that made him a master escape artist also made him a ruthlessly efficient predator. And it was only a matter of time before his need for control would lead to murder. December 15, 1987. Minot, North Dakota. Sherry Woods, a 25-year-old single mother, was working the overnight shift at a local truck stop when Richard McNair walked through the front door with a .22 caliber rifle. What happened next revealed the full depths of McNair's depravity. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution performed by a man who wanted to see what it felt like to end another human being's life. McNair forced Woods into the back office, where he made her empty the cash register and safe. But the money was never his primary motivation. Witnesses would later testify that McNair seemed more interested in studying Woods's fear than in stealing from the business. For nearly an hour, McNair held Woods hostage while deciding whether to let her live or die. He asked her about her family, her children, her hopes for the future, not out of compassion, but out of curiosity about what it would mean to destroy those possibilities. In the end, McNair's curiosity won. He shot Sherry Woods twice in the chest, killing her instantly, then calmly walked out of the truck stop with less than $100 in stolen money. The murder was McNair's graduation from petty crime to the kind of evil that would eventually put him on the FBI's most wanted list. But it also marked the beginning of his most deadly skill, the ability to become invisible in plain sight. When police arrived at the crime scene, McNair had already vanished. He would remain free for over a year, living under false identities, committing robberies across the Midwest, and refining the escape techniques that would later make him a legend among criminals and law enforcement alike. The manhunt for Sherry Woods's killer revealed the first institutional failure in what would become a pattern of law enforcement inadequacy. Local police departments weren't equipped to track a suspect who could change identities as easily as changing clothes, who understood forensic countermeasures, and who possessed the patience to plan his crimes months in advance. When McNair was finally captured in 1988, it was only because of a routine traffic stop, not because of any brilliant investigative work. The arrest was a stroke of luck that temporarily ended one of the most sophisticated criminal careers in American history. But putting Richard McNair in prison was like caging a wild animal. He immediately began planning his escape, studying every aspect of the facility's security, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to prove that no wall could hold him. 1992, North Dakota State Penitentiary. Richard McNair had been incarcerated for 4 years, serving a life sentence without parole for the murder of Sherry Woods. Prison officials believed they had finally contained one of the state's most dangerous criminals. They were catastrophically wrong. McNair had spent every day of his incarceration studying the prison's weaknesses. He memorized guard schedules, mapped surveillance blind spots, and cultivated relationships with other inmates who could provide information about the facility's operations. But McNair's greatest advantage wasn't his intelligence, it was the institutional complacency that made prison officials underestimate him. They saw a quiet, well-behaved inmate who caused no trouble and seemed to have accepted his fate. They had no idea they were dealing with a predator who was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The escape itself was a masterpiece of timing and preparation. McNair had discovered that the prison's ventilation system connected to an unused part of the building that was only occasionally patrolled. Over months, he carefully loosened the screws on a ventilation grate in his cell, creating an exit route that would be invisible to casual inspection. On the night of his escape, McNair waited until the 3 a.m. guard check, then immediately began his meticulously planned journey through the ventilation system. He had calculated exactly how long each stage of the escape would take and knew he had a narrow window of opportunity before his absence would be discovered. The route through the ventilation shafts was cramped, dangerous, and led through areas of the building that hadn't been properly maintained in years. McNair crawled through spaces barely wider than his shoulders, navigating by memory and instinct in complete darkness. When he finally emerged from the system, McNair found himself in an abandoned wing of the prison that was scheduled for renovation. From there, it was a simple matter of picking the lock on an exterior door and walking to freedom. The escape wasn't discovered until the morning head count, giving McNair nearly 6 hours of lead time, more than enough for a man who had spent years planning his next move. Within hours, one of the largest manhunts in North Dakota history was underway. But McNair had already disappeared into the vast American landscape, leaving behind no clues about his destination or intentions. For 10 months, Richard McNair remained free while law enforcement agencies across the country searched for a ghost. He robbed banks in Colorado, burglarized homes in Montana, and committed assaults in Wyoming, always staying one step ahead of the massive law enforcement dragnet closing in around him. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a psychological profile that described McNair as one of the most dangerous fugitives in American history. He combined the cunning of a master criminal with the violence of a cold-blooded killer and the escape skills that made him nearly impossible to contain. But McNair's freedom came to an end in 1993 when he was captured after a high-speed chase in Wyoming. The arrest was another stroke of luck. McNair had been pulled over for a routine traffic violation and tried to flee when the officer recognized his name. This time, authorities were determined not to underestimate him. McNair was transferred to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, where he would be kept in solitary confinement under constant surveillance. Prison officials were confident that they had finally found a cage that could hold Richard McNair. They were wrong again. 2005, ADX Florence, Colorado. The administrative maximum facility, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, housed the most dangerous criminals in American history. Terrorists, spies, cartel leaders, and serial killers lived in 23-hour-a-day lockdown, monitored by cameras, motion sensors, and guards trained to prevent exactly the kind of escape that Richard McNair was planning. McNair had been at ADX Florence for over a decade, and prison officials had grown comfortable with his apparent acceptance of his fate. He was a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, and seemingly broken by years of solitary confinement. But McNair was actually conducting the most sophisticated prison intelligence operation in criminal history. He had spent years studying every aspect of ADX Florence's security, from guard rotations to surveillance patterns to the psychological profiles of individual staff members. McNair's escape plan required a level of patience and precision that bordered on the superhuman. He had identified a weakness in the prison's mail system that would allow him to obtain tools and materials without detection. Over months, he assembled a kit of specialized equipment that included lockpicks, cutting tools, and even a primitive computer that could hack into the prison's security systems. The technical details of McNair's escape from ADX Florence remain classified by the Bureau of Prisons, but investigators later described it as the most sophisticated prison break in American history. McNair somehow managed to defeat multiple layers of electronic security, bypass motion sensors and cameras, and escape from a facility that was supposedly escape-proof. When guards discovered McNair's empty cell on April 5, 2006, they initially refused to believe that an escape was possible. The security systems showed no breaches. The cameras had recorded nothing unusual. The motion sensors had detected no unauthorized movement. It was as if McNair had simply dematerialized and walked through the walls of the most secure prison in America. The FBI's investigation into the escape revealed institutional failures at every level of prison operations. Security protocols that looked impressive on paper had been compromised by human error, equipment failures, and the simple fact that no system designed by humans could account for the twisted genius of Richard Lee McNair. Within hours, the largest manhunt in federal law enforcement history was underway. The FBI, U.S. Marshal Service, and local police departments across the country were mobilized to find a fugitive who had just accomplished the impossible. But Richard McNair had already vanished into the American landscape, beginning a 15-month game of cat and mouse that would test the limits of law enforcement and reveal the true depths of his criminal genius. From April 2006 to July 2007, Richard Lee McNair lived freely among the American public while hundreds of federal agents searched for a phantom who seemed to possess supernatural abilities to avoid detection. McNair's survival strategy revealed the full scope of his criminal genius. He had spent years in prison studying identity theft, document forgery, and counter-surveillance techniques. When he escaped, he was prepared to create new identities, obtain legitimate employment, and blend seamlessly into communities across the country. The FBI's investigation revealed that McNair had lived in at least 6 different states during his time as a fugitive. He worked construction jobs in Texas, waited tables in Colorado, and even volunteered at a homeless shelter in New Mexico, all while one of the most intensive manhunts in American history searched for him. McNair's ability to hide in plain sight was matched by his continuing criminal activities. Bank robberies in Arizona, burglaries in Utah, and armed robberies in Nevada bore the hallmarks of his methodical approach to crime. But he was careful never to commit crimes that would generate enough attention to trigger a federal investigation. The psychological profile created by FBI behavioral analysts described McNair as a criminal chameleon who could adapt his personality and appearance to any situation. Witnesses who encountered him during his time as a fugitive described him as charming, helpful, and completely ordinary, the last person anyone would suspect of being one of America's most wanted criminals. But McNair's greatest skill wasn't his ability to commit crimes or evade capture. It was his understanding of human psychology and institutional weaknesses. He knew that law enforcement agencies were bureaucratic organizations with predictable patterns and blind spots. He exploited those weaknesses with the precision of a master strategist. The manhunt for McNair revealed devastating failures in interagency communication and coordination. Local police departments didn't receive timely updates about his movements. Federal agencies competed rather than cooperated, and crucial intelligence was lost in bureaucratic shuffle. These institutional failures allowed McNair to remain free for over a year while committing dozens of crimes across the western United States. Each successful crime made him more confident, more daring, and ultimately more careless. The beginning of the end came when McNair decided to return to his home state of North Dakota for reasons that investigators never fully understood. It was a decision that violated every rule of fugitive survival and suggested that even criminal geniuses can be undone by psychological compulsions they can't control. July 5, 2007. Interstate 94, near Jamestown, North Dakota. Deputy Sheriff Michael Aker was conducting a routine traffic stop on a white van traveling eastbound when he encountered the most dangerous fugitive in America. The driver handed over an Iowa driver's license bearing the name Robert Jones, one of dozens of false identities that McNair had used during his 15 months of freedom. The license looked legitimate, the registration matched, and the driver seemed calm and cooperative. But Deputy Aker had an instinct that something was wrong. The driver's story about traveling to visit family didn't quite add up. His nervousness seemed excessive for a routine traffic stop. And there was something about his eyes that suggested depths of violence that contradicted his mild demeanor. What happened next became one of the most famous traffic stops in law enforcement history. Aker ran the license through his computer system while engaging the driver in casual conversation. The system showed no warrants or alerts for Robert Jones, but Aker's instincts told him to dig deeper. McNair, meanwhile, was calculating his options. He was armed and could easily kill the deputy, but that would trigger a massive manhunt that would end his freedom. He could attempt to flee, but his van was no match for a police cruiser. Or he could continue his deception and hope that his false identity would hold up under scrutiny. For nearly 20 minutes, the two men engaged in a verbal chess match that would determine whether one of America's most wanted fugitives would remain free or return to prison. McNair used every manipulation technique in his psychological arsenal, trying to convince Aker that he was just an ordinary citizen who had been pulled over for a minor traffic violation. But Deputy Aker had decades of experience reading people, and something about Robert Jones set off every alarm bell in his head. The man's story kept changing in small ways. His body language suggested someone accustomed to violence. And his knowledge of local geography didn't match his claim to be visiting family in the area. The breakthrough came when Aker asked McNair to step out of the van for a more detailed search. As McNair complied, the deputy noticed scars on his hands and arms that were consistent with someone who had spent years in prison. More importantly, he noticed that McNair moved with the careful, controlled movements of someone accustomed to being watched and evaluated. When Aker asked for additional identification, McNair's composure finally cracked. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and the deputy saw the cold, calculating intelligence of a predator who was running out of options. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. When Aker finally ran McNair's fingerprints through the federal database, the computer exploded with alerts and warnings. Within minutes, FBI agents were racing to the scene of the traffic stop that had ended one of the most intensive manhunts in American history. Richard Lee McNair, master escape artist and cold-blooded killer, had finally run out of luck and options. August 2007. United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, Florence, Colorado. Richard McNair returned to the supermax prison he had escaped from just over a year earlier, but this time, authorities were taking no chances. McNair was placed in the most secure cell in the facility, monitored 24 hours a day by guards who had been specifically trained to watch for escape attempts. Every item in his cell was scrutinized for potential use as an escape tool. Every visitor was thoroughly searched. Every piece of mail was examined under microscope. The Bureau of Prisons conducted an exhaustive investigation into McNair's previous escapes, implementing new security protocols designed to prevent any future breakouts. The report remained largely classified, but prison officials acknowledged that McNair had exploited weaknesses in their systems that no one had previously considered. But even in maximum security, McNair continued to plan. Guards reported that he spent hours studying the architecture of his cell, testing the strength of fixtures, and observing the behavior patterns of staff members. The man who had escaped from America's most secure prisons wasn't ready to accept that he had finally been contained. In 2010, McNair made one final escape attempt that revealed both his persistent genius and the ultimate futility of his situation. Using materials smuggled in through the prison's medical system, he constructed a device that could disable the electronic locks on his cell door. The attempt failed when guards discovered his preparations during a routine search, but the sophistication of the plan convinced authorities that McNair would never stop trying to escape. He was transferred to an even more secure facility and placed under the kind of surveillance typically reserved for international terrorists. Richard McNair would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, monitored by cameras, surrounded by guards, and denied any meaningful human contact. It was a fate that many observers considered appropriate for a man who had terrorized law enforcement and taken innocent lives in pursuit of his twisted freedom. But even imprisonment couldn't diminish the legend that McNair had created. His escapes became the subject of law enforcement training courses, criminal justice textbooks, and countless hours of analysis by security experts trying to prevent future breakouts. The man who had walked through walls had finally met a wall he couldn't breach. Today, Richard Lee McNair remains incarcerated at ADX Florence, serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. At 65 years old, he continues to be classified as one of the most dangerous prisoners in the American correctional system. His 3 successful prison escapes, including 2 from maximum security facilities, remain unsurpassed in modern criminal history. The techniques he developed influenced security protocols at prisons across the country and forced a fundamental reimagining of what it means to contain the most dangerous criminals. But McNair's legacy extends beyond his criminal achievements to the institutional failures that made his crimes possible. The police departments that couldn't track him, the prisons that couldn't hold him, and the federal agencies that couldn't coordinate their efforts revealed systemic weaknesses that terrorists and other criminals have since exploited. The victims of McNair's crimes, Sherry Woods and the countless others who suffered during his escapes and time as a fugitive, represent the human cost of a system that consistently underestimated the threat he posed. Their deaths and trauma serve as reminders that institutional failures have real consequences for real people. Law enforcement officials who participated in the manhunts for McNair described the experience as simultaneously the most challenging and educational of their careers. His ability to exploit weaknesses in security systems, communication protocols, and human psychology forced them to fundamentally reconsider their approaches to fugitive investigation. The traffic stop that finally ended McNair's criminal career has become legendary among law enforcement officers, cited as an example of how training, instinct, and persistence can triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal mind. Deputy Sheriff Michael Acker's decision to trust his instincts despite the lack of concrete evidence potentially saved countless lives. McNair himself has never expressed remorse for his crimes or shown any interest in helping authorities understand his methods. He remains a cipher, brilliant, dangerous, and utterly without conscience. Psychiatric evaluations describe him as a textbook psychopath whose only regret is that he was finally captured. The manhunts for Richard McNair cost taxpayers millions of dollars and consumed thousands of hours of law enforcement time that could have been spent solving other crimes. But they also resulted in improved security protocols, better interagency communication, and a deeper understanding of how criminal genius can exploit institutional weaknesses. Today, the cells that once held McNair have been redesigned with his escape techniques in mind. Prison systems across the country have implemented security measures specifically designed to contain escape artists of his caliber. The phantom who walked through walls has finally been contained, but only through extraordinary measures that acknowledge his unique and terrible talents. Richard Lee McNair's story serves as a stark reminder that intelligence without conscience creates monsters, that institutions must constantly evolve to address new threats, and that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who appear most ordinary. The phantom has finally been caged, but the legend of the man who walked through walls will continue to haunt law enforcement and fascinate true crime enthusiasts for generations to come.